Hey guys, Spartan Theology here. Today I'm having a conversation with Kyle Alander. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Kyle Alander. I run a page called Christian Idealism, and I am part of the what they call the quantum idealist movement, which is pretty much a movement in apologetics. It's a new type of apologetics. Actually, it's very different than the traditional apologetics, and so that's what we're gonna be discussing.
Yeah, definitely very different and very interesting, and I'd say pretty well supported. I'm still looking into all of this, which Kyle will lay out for you guys. So let's just jump right into it. What is idealism?
Well, idealism is the belief that the universe itself is fundamentally mental. So when most people think of now, idealism is a form of metaphysics. So in metaphysics, you have mainly three different positions. You have materialism, dualism, and an idealism. So materialism is the view of what most atheists hold to, which is basically that the world is material and all that really exists is matter and energy and the rearrangement of it, and that's basically it. That consciousness, mental state, stuff like that is it only exists because of matter, right? And then you have dualism, which is what most Christian and theologians hold to nowadays, which is the belief that yeah, there is matter and energy, but then there's also the spiritual side, which is the mind, the soul, and whatnot. But idealism is completely different, where it's not. It doesn't have. It doesn't have the traditional dualistic sense. It has this, like I said before, it has the mind as fundamental, and matter is really basically the universe is a dream, a simulation. Essentially, that's basically what I mean. That's the best way I can explain it. But just that consciousness is fundamental, and that the universe itself, the materiality of the universe is an illusion. So that's pretty much what idealism is, at least the basic definition.
Yeah, cool. So, were you ever like a dualist, materialist, and why did you, come to be an idealist?
Well, I was growing up in a Christian church in a Christian family. I was a dualist during that time, obviously, because that's the default position for most people. Um, and then what happened was I was a young Earth creationist, so I was arguing against evolution. I don't want to go off topic, but so I rejected evolution theory. I rejected, I believe the Earth is 6,000 years old, but then I kind of basically studied science and realized, well, no, this view is wrong. So I became a theistic evolutionist. But the main issue I had with dualism was the interaction problem, which is basically how can an immaterial thing interact with a material thing? How are you going to have two completely separate substances interact? And I realized that this was a major problem that no apologist, at least for the most part, couldn't really address. Like it's a problem that is logically, any attempt to solve it would be a non sequitur. So you literally have to commit a non sequitur in order to solve it. And the reason why is because if the immaterial can act on the material, then they must have a shared property, and therefore they can't be separate substances. They have to be the same substance. And so once I realized that dualism was false, then I became obviously an atheist, because I didn't know about idealism at the time. So I kind of became an atheist, and I held to materialism. But then I came across idealism, which is the opposite, which is basically, no, it's not matter that's fundamental, it's the mind. And the mind is really all there is. Now, when most people think of idealism, they automatically think of solipsism. But my view is that it's God's mind that simulates the universe, and then it's our minds that interact within the universe. So yeah, that's pretty much my story. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but that's basically the underline of my story.
Yeah, I wasn't asking. Yeah, that's perfect. Just like, how did
Yeah.
you come to materialism or
Yeah.
idealism? Were there any like people that uh introduced you to idealism?
Yes. When I first came across it, I came across it on YouTube actually. There's this channel called Inspiring Philosophy, and it was I think the first video on his channel I watched was the case for free will, and he showed through quantum mechanics that you could, we have free will and such. And I kind of, at first I was kind of skeptical, like, okay, is this guy really, being serious? So I looked through his channel, and then I came across this one video called Quantum Physics Debunks Materialism. I watched that. I didn't understand the physics, obviously. I think most people wouldn't really understand it from a layman perspective, but I kind of regret, I was like, okay, well, he's all, and then that's when the word idealism came into mind. That's when I first saw what that actually meant. And I was like, well, what is this view? Like, it's not dualism, because I already knew dualism was false. So, well, what's idealism? So I started looking into it. And then the next video that really, the one video that really got me like into an existential crisis was, what was that? Oh yeah. So there was the video called "The Digital Physics Argument for the Existence of God." It's on Inspired Philosophy's channel. I watched that video, and yeah, that's when I really, like, I don't know how to explain it, but I was, that's when I guess that's the time when I converted to idealism. I guess the official moment. I was like, well, this argument just completely shocked me. Like, this is not a typical argument for God. Like, people don't argue that the world is a simulation and then argue that God exists. That's not typically what apologists do. So I was really shocked, and I yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, that's pretty much what got me first looking into idealism. So
Yeah, Inspiring Philosophy is definitely a great channel, and a lot of people like accuse him of just bullcrap. But I mean, I really think it's just because they don't really understand the physics and the philosophy behind a lot of his videos. But
yeah.
ever since you became an idealist, like as all right, ever since you became an idealist, is that kind of what like set your I guess passion to you know introduce people to it?
Well, yeah. I mean, I mean, like I said before, it's really different. It's not the arguments for idealism are not the same as the traditional. William Lane. You have William Lane Craig, Frank Turek. You have those type of apologists. They give arguments for God. They try to, they argue that the universe had a beginning, or objective morality, or whatnot. But idealism, it gets down to the nature of reality itself. And once you start to argue from that perspective, the arguments are much more different, because then if the nature of reality, if idealism is true, then inevitably either theism is true or solipsism is true. I mean, if you really want to go down, once you accept idealism, either you become a solipsist or you become a theist. Like, those are really the only two logical options, in my opinion. So yeah, it's really, the arguments are very strong, and I would recommend that people look into that.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, a lot of those apologists, like Frank Turek, I just don't really think they're all that. I mean, of course, William Lane Craig is definitely well read. He's done, 20 plus years of research, PhD level research. But like Frank Turek just seems to be like recycling a bunch of William Lane Craig's arguments to, I guess,
Yeah,
because they're just trying to introduce it to a layman audience.
yeah. Yeah, that's why I don't want to criticize them. I mean, I
Yeah,
understand what they're doing. It's just, there's a point where people they're not gonna watch that the whole time. They're gonna look for other people, other resources besides them. So yeah, um, if you really want to get into make better arguments for God, I say go for idealism. But yeah,
yeah, I definitely think all of these idealist arguments are a good way for the to strengthen people's faiths. And let's dive into some of the arguments. And I know, like you said, you're not like like above a layman, but you're not an expert. So to try to communicate to a layman, how would you at least like describe, say, the digital physics argument?
Okay, so for the digital physics argument, there are different formalizations. There's like scientific ways you can argue for it, but the traditional way that you argue for it, and the one I'm gonna present is the one that actually converted me to idealism in the first place. Okay, so I believe the first premise is, let me think. Hold on, let me go to my notes real quick because I wrote these down earlier. So just give me a second. Where is it? Okay, crap. I can't find it. I'll go off it by memory. Oh wait, I found it. Never mind. Okay. So premise 1 is that simulations can only exist in a computer or in a mind. Premise 2, the universe is a simulation. Premise 3, a simulation in a computer must still be simulated in a mind. Premise 4, therefore the universe is a simulation in a mind. Premise 5, this mind is what we call God, and therefore God exists. Now, of course, skeptics are going to attack, I would say, the second premise, which is the universe is a simulation. Now, the arguments for this are very simple. So Brian Whitworth a computer scientist, he did a paper comparing the virtual reality hypothesis with the objective reality hypothesis. And what he basically, I don't have the papers to show it. I mean, you can reference it in your video if you want. But basically, he concluded that the virtual reality hypothesis better fits the data than the objective reality hypothesis. And then we also have the holographic principle, which states, it was kind of interesting how it's discovered. Basically, the basic idea is that our universe is a 2D surface on a 3D. So the universe is basically a hologram. That's why it's called the holographic principle. I mean, that's the best way I can explain it. And then also the final thing, I think the most important, is the falsification of realism, which is realism is a belief that objects exist independent of observation, meaning that they exist independent. They exist in their physical form independent of observation. And the fact that that was falsified is strong evidence that we live in a simulation. And finally, emergent space-time, which states that space and time are emergent. And on materialism, if you accept materialism, objects have to be fundamental. I mean, that's the definition of materialism, that matter itself is fundamental. But when you look into emergent space-time, you realize, well, wait a minute. If space-time is emergent and if physical objects can only exist in space-time, then that means physical objects themselves cannot be fundamental, and therefore materialism is false. And so that would be very powerful evidence for the simulation, that we live in a simulation. Now, this isn't all the evidence, but that is the basic evidence. We can go into more detail if you want, but that's the basic idea. Now, okay, let me continue. Now, now the skeptics say, well, wait a minute, if we do live in a simulation, how do we know we're not simulated computer? Well, you could argue that we are. The only problem, though, is even if we are simulated in computer, it turns out that computer would also have to be simulated. Now, people will say, well, how do you know that? Well, it's very simple. There's this problem called the qubit unpacking problem. Basically, the idea is that if you want to unpack all the qubits into classical bits, it turns out you would literally have to have a computer larger than the universe. And the reason why is because all the qubits, or the superpositions within our universe, in order for that to be classically defined, as in, in order for that to exist in a quote unquote real material universe, you need a computer larger than the universe itself. And therefore, the more logical option is that instead of us being simulated in a physical, real material computer, we're just simulated in God's mind. So, yeah. And that's the digital, that's the digital physics argument for God.
Yeah, but so that's definitely an idealist argument. But is there like kind of little gish galloping a little bit, but we'll get back to the real stuff. Could you get like any of these idealist arguments to like work under a form of dualism, or is that just completely like
Well,
I'm talking like
yes.
you could
Well, yeah.
reformulate it?
Yes, yes. I think Johan and Ratz did a blog on this. I didn't read it, so I can't really give my opinion on it. But yeah, you can't, technically, you could argue, you could use these idealistic arguments and still hold a dualism. The only issue, though, is you're still going to have the interaction problem. You know, you're still going to have um, the problem of how can God do miracles and whatnot. So yeah, you can still hold the dualism, but there's really no reason to do that. You know, so if you want to take the more logical option, you just accept idealism. So
Yeah, you've talked like at least on Facebook a lot about the measurement problem. I think that's what you were referring to earlier. Could you
the me-
describe?
the yeah the how objects don't exist independent of observation.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
yeah, the one inspiring philosophy did a video on. Could you maybe
Okay.
like explain that more to the audience?
Okay. So one of the most powerful pieces of evidence for us living in a simulation is the fact that objects um, don't exist in their physical form. Now, I want to make that clear to my audience that I'm not saying that consciousness creates reality. That's not all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that consciousness creates the physical appearance of reality. And this could be paralleled with how video games work. So if you're playing a video game, let's say GTA or um, Call of Duty, and if you look at an object in that game, the object, the physical appearance of that object is there when you're looking at it. But then if you look away from that object, it's not really there, right? That's the basic principle of how all video games work. And so that it turns out that's actually true for reality as well. When you look at an object, it's in its physical form, but when you don't look at that object, it's no longer in its physical form. Now, the information is still there. It's still there, you can, you can touch it, but it's not there in its physical form. And so I think when we talk about the measurement problem, we're talking about the different, now this will go into the different interpretations of quantum mechanics. So the one that says that consciousness creates the physical appearance is the orthodox interpretation. And that was the simplest, most parsimonious interpretation that was first started. Now, ever since then, there have been many attempts to try to get around it by having these other interpretations. There's the many worlds interpretation, Bohemian mechanics, and the GRW theories. Now, as for the Copenhagen interpretation, that's the Copenhagen interpretation and the Orthodox interpretation. Those two interpretations are the same one. The only difference between them two is that the Copenhagen one is more pragmatic, which means that it's not the observer, it's not the conscious observer that causes collapse, but rather it's just a measuring apparatus. Now, many physicists or materialists would try to argue that that all you need is a measuring apparatus. Well, yeah, I agree, but the only issue is what caused the collapse of the measuring apparatus, and so forth, and so on and so on. And so eventually you have to get back to something that's not, not a particle, or not something that's, just a measure. It has to be a conscious observer at the end, at the end of the day. And so if that is the philosophical implication, and that's very powerful evidence against materialism, and it's very powerful evidence that we live in a simulation.
All right, yeah, cool. So you
And
said
then
both mechanic. Wait, what?
did you want to get into the interpretations,
Yeah, I
or?
was just gonna ask, since it's kind of for people who haven't really heard a lot of these terms, I'd say, I mean, at least in my experience, the biggest objection to the orthodox would be Bowman mechanics. Could you like explain kind of what that is and why it doesn't necessarily work?
Okay, So Bohemian mechanics is, well, first of all, it's not. Most physicists reject it, and I'll explain. I mean, there's good reasons why, but basically, Bohemian mechanics there's no wave function in the they call it the pilot wave, and then through this you get the collapse of the wave function just happens by the pilot wave, and you don't need a conscious observer and whatnot. And what it basically tries to say realism again, which is this belief that physical objects exist independent of observation. Now, as far as the problems go, there are many problems with it. One of the biggest problems is the superposition principle. One of the big things that Bohemian mechanics rejects is the superposition principle, and the very fact that we can observe the superposition principle all the time would be evidence against Bohemian mechanics. And then also with relativity, you have so sorry. Okay. So with relativity, you have special relativity, and it turns out it's incompatible with special relativity. So they have to hold to this ad hoc Lorentzian relativity, which is ad hoc on top of trying to, what's it called? Getting the pilot waves to go faster than the speed of light. I mean, that's basic. I mean, you literally have to violate relativity itself. Extremely ad hoc. Like, and now, of course, Bohemian supporters will try to, defend the theory by having these solutions to these problems. But the issue is, even with these solutions, it's still ad hoc. That's the whole point. I mean, I could make up any theory, I could make up any interpretation of quantum mechanics I want. It doesn't matter. It's always going to be more ad hoc than just the orthodox interpretation. And so, yeah, you can hold. So, yeah, Bohemian mechanics is possible, but just because something is possible doesn't mean that we should just accept it. Possibility is not probability, and so there's no reason to hold to it. Rather than the only reason to hold to it is if you have metaphysical presuppositions. That's literally the only reason why anyone should hold to it. But yeah.
Yeah, you run a blog and you did responses to the YouTuber Chocolate Hat, a YouTube atheist.
Yeah.
He did raise some decent objections, I guess, but I know it's too much to go over now. But would you like to sort of give a brief little synopsis of what his arguments were? Because I think he actually didn't. If I'm not mistaken, didn't he rely a lot on Bohemian mechanics?
Yeah. He used Bohemian mechanics, but he also tried to argue that basically there's different interpretations, and therefore materialism hasn't been debunked. But yeah, when it comes now, he did. Another thing I want to mention is he used the decoherence argument, which is actually a non sequitur. I mean, yeah, there's decoherence, but the observer is what causes decoherence in the first place. So basically, everything is decoherent with respect to the observer, and in anything not decoherent is isolated, and therefore is coherent, is in a superposition. So I want to respond to that. And then also, me and Johanna Ratz actually we did a 3-hour response to the last 3 of his videos. So if you want to go check that out as well, we kind of just debunked every single argument he made. But basically, to sum up that his response, he literally just he appealed to these pseudoscientific interpretations to basically say materialism. I mean, that's basically all he really did. So, yeah.
Yeah. So for say the audience, if they find this interesting and want to, get into this field of apologetics, where would you recommend they start? Like besides, say they've watched Inspiring Philosophy's channel, which I'm sure most Christians here on YouTube have. But say what would you say is maybe the next step for them?
Well, I would say just do the research, because it turned out The evidence, even the evidence in inspiring philosophy, that's not all the evidence. I'm not going to go over all the evidence here, but I recommend do your research and look and see, what the science says. Like, if you want to get into idealism, ask questions. You can ask inspiring philosophy, but if you want to do something like me, like a blog, then all you have to really do is just study it and understand it, and then you could start doing responses to people, and you can defend it well. So
Yeah. So, like going back to what you said at the beginning, a lot of Christian apologists are dualists. Uh, is idealism compatible with the Bible?
oh yeah, it is. I mean, if you look at the idealism is it's actually taught, not taught directly, like they don't call it idealism, but there's this doctrine called the essence energy distinction, which basically teaches that God's mind, that the universe depends on God, or creation depends on God. And so you get a few verse. I mean, there's a whole doctrine in it, but there are verses in the Bible that say that, even our being depends on God. Now, from a dualistic perspective, that doesn't make any sense. You know, if we're gonna say we depend on God, well, what does that mean on dualism? Like, if the world is not a simulation, if it's just material, then it should make sense to say that we wouldn't necessarily depend on God. But it actually says that mankind, humans, beings, the universe itself depends on God for existence. And so that would make sense under an idealist view, which is basically the view that we are a simulation in God's mind. So again, that doctrine is the essence energy distinction. Inspiring Philosophy did a video called Christianity and Pantheism. We can watch that. That basically sums up why idealism is taught in Scripture. So it's very compatible with Scripture. And not only that, but if you look at the meaning for the word soul, it doesn't actually mean this immaterial thing that exists apart from the material body. What it means is it's us. Like, what I mean by that is we don't have a soul, we are a soul, which wouldn't make sense under dualism, since then that would be kind of, hylomorphism, where you have the material body and that's it. But of course there is an afterlife. So if we want to be more consistent with historical Christianity, then I think we should accept idealism, because that seems to be what the soul is actually referred to. It doesn't mean this dualistic sense of, there's this body and soul. What it means is it's just the soul. And in the body, of course, under idealism, the body would also be immaterial. So just as the mind is immaterial, the body itself is immaterial, since we're a simulation. And so the whole idea that the body is quote unquote material, that doesn't really show up anywhere in the Bible. Um, so yeah, I would say not only is it compatible with Christianity, but Christianity basically teaches idealism. That I think that you can make I can make a pretty good argument for that. So yeah.
Yeah, agreed. And kind of going off what you said on the soul, I think a big misconception of the soul is that we kind of go off what Plato said, many, many, many years back, that it's sort of like a ghost in a machine. But like under idealism, what is the soul? So is it under idealism is it essentially just a mind distinct from the body,
Well, the mind. Well, on idealism.
the brain, or something
Well,
like that?
on idealism. You see, on idealism, there is no such thing as material, right? So there is no material body. So our bodies would essentially be quote unquote immaterial. So this whole idea, for your whole concept of material body, throw that out. Now we're going to place it with immaterial body, and then we have the immaterial body interacting with the immaterial soul, or the mind, And then so what you have here when it comes to the relationship between the soul, the soul and the brain, basically what you have is the soul is deeply connected to the brain. So for example, if you damage the brain, you can damage the mind. But at the same time, the mind has the ability to interfere with the brain and, you know, causes us to have free will and whatnot. But at the same time, it's not ontologically separate from the brain. So the brain is not ontologically different than the mind. The mind and the brain are the same substance. It's just the mind has the ability to change the brain in a way that seems very monistic. Like, and it's now when most people, when most people think of monism, they automatically think of materialism because that seems, you know, that's most people go by. But it turns out that under idealism, it's still monism. So yeah, if you damage the brain, damage the mind, and vice versa. But you don't have, the two things aren't ontologically separate. They're the same ontological substance, and so you just that's what you get. And then IP also has a video series on this as well if you want to check that out. So
Yeah, interesting stuff. It's getting really late where I'm at, so I think I have time for about two more questions. Um, what are some like possible defeaters for idealism, if any?
well, I I'd actually have to think about this.
Oh, it's fine. Answer.
Let me think. What would be a defeater? Well, first of all, um, if the materialist can somehow show that the mind is emergent from the brain in a non sequitur, you know, if they don't argue it for in a non sequitur way, then I guess that would be evidence. Or another way you could do it is if you a really good way you could do it actually is if you basically proved local realism true, which there's actually a challenge called the quantum Randi challenge. And if you can accomplish that challenge and basically prove local realism, then that would be strong evidence that we don't live in a simulation, and thus that would be strong evidence that idealism is most likely false. So that's another way you can do it. And so yeah, I'd have to, again, that's kind of a tricky question, but those
Yeah,
are two ways
I
to
think
do
we'll
it.
save that for like next episode.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. Anyway, a little question here to end it. Besides inspiring philosophy, are there any other YouTube channels that someone could watch to learn more?
Well, Johann Ratz, he's probably the biggest one. He has a lot of content. He actually has more content on idealism than inspiring philosophy, and he gets into different aspects of it. Like he did a video on miracles and stuff like that. As far as any other YouTubers, not that I know of. I have my channel, but I don't. The videos that I have are mostly just hangouts. But Johann Ratz is probably, if you really want to get into idealism, I would highly recommend you go to his channel. He was actually going to be here today, but he couldn't make it. So, yeah, again, you could go check out his channel. He has a lot of good content. So,
Yeah, Johanna was supposed to come, but I was having internet issues. But next episode, I plan to have obviously Kyle on, and I plan to have Johanna on, and we'll get really deep into or at least they'll
yeah,
get really deep into the whole physics and I guess neuroscience and all behind idealism.
yeah. So this was just, you know,
Kind
basic
of,
introduction.
yeah,
But
just
yeah,
an introduction. I guess I'll just retitle it to an introduction to idealism. But yeah, that's it.
yep.
Thanks.